Chapter 9 Retrospect. When Alexander died, he was not yet 33. He was carried off at the very height of his youthful vigor. Like his ancestor and model Achilles, he had not completed the 13th year of his reign. A retrospect of his gigantic life work brings before us a personality of quite unique genius, a marvelous mixture of demonic passion and sober clearness of judgment. In this iron-willed man of action, who was a realist in policy if anyone ever was, beneath the surface lay a non-rational element, for example, his longing for the undiscovered and the mysterious, which, coupled with his will to conquer and his delight in scientific discovery, sent him to the limits of the known world. Among these elusive factors, also which are without a rational basis, was his lively faith in his descent from Heracles and Achilles, which supplied him with much impetus and vigor. In his simple piety, which was in no way undermined by philosophical skepticism, he was firmly persuaded that he was under the special protection of the gods, and therefore believed in his mission. In a recent brilliant essay on ancient generalship, it was said, "This sense of divine possession is characteristic of the conduct of the great men of antiquity." That is true of no one more than Alexander. Consequently, he saw in the prophet's salutation of himself as son of Ammon only a confirmation of the divine energy which he felt within him. And that is why later he demanded divine honors from the Greeks and required from them the recognition of his apotheosis. This firm belief in his mission gave him an absolute confidence in victory. Without which his will and actions would be unintelligible. The supernatural in his temperament gave him also his control over men. The general and the statesman are indissolubly bound up in Alexander. As general, he was the executioner of his political will. The general is easier to comprehend, since we have finished performances to survey, whereas the tasks of the statesman were still in process of evolution when he died. Alexander is the type of the royal general, who has unlimited control over the military material and apparatus of his country, and is responsible to himself alone. He had no trials for conduct in the field to fear, such as the Athenian democracy loved, and no need to whitewash himself. Moreover, as hegemon of the Corinthian League, he was outside any military criticism of the Sanhedrion. He had further the good fortune to inherit the best army in the world at the time, together with a tried body of officers, and to have been initiated into the art of war by his father, who was himself a great general. These fortunate conditions made it easier for him fully to develop his military genius. But the important point was that this genius was born in him. It is quite unnecessary to recur to the modern attempt to transfer the credit for his military achievements to Parmenio and to contest his own strategic glory. Military experts in ancient as in modern times agree that Alexander, as a general, was as great a genius as any in history. As a tactician, we saw him fight and win the three great pitched battles, the Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela, by the oblique battle formation developed by his father, but only the tactical idea was common to them. Its execution in detail Alexander varied according to the peculiarities of the ground and of the enemy, most elaborately in the dangerous situation at Gaugamela, which led him to the idea of a second battle line with a possible square formation. Completely different was the set of problems he had to solve in the terribly difficult guerrilla war in eastern Iran. Here we have a still more brilliant exhibition of his independence of his father's tradition, his operations with flying corps, and his adaptation to the different mode of warfare of the new enemy. The severe fighting in the mountainous region north of Kabul, and especially the capture of Oronos, display Alexander in all his greatness. Perhaps the most signal stroke of genius is to be seen in his last great field battle on the Hellespont, when he had to deal with the totally new problem presented by the huge elephant host of Porus. His strategic genius we saw from the beginning in his plan for the Asiatic campaign, according to which, on account of the difficult situation in Greece, he resolved first to win the Mediterranean coast of the Persian Empire with his land army in order to eliminate the superior Persian fleet. We saw with what tenacity, and how in spite of all temptations, he pursued his plan, up to the conquest of Egypt, and how thus he actually became master of the sea. When he led his army into the interior of Asia, he faced new problems. Up to the Euphrates, the march of the 10,000 had made all clear, and Xenophon had familiarized the Greek world with their route. What lay beyond the Euphrates was completely unknown country. So it was into mysterious distances that Alexander led his army, overcoming all natural obstacles, over the snowy Hindu Kush and over broad rivers, and finally through the Punjab to the Hippasus, where the morale of his troops gave out and he turned round. Yet there is nothing adventurous in his march. On the one hand, always and from the beginning he tried to get advance information about the foreign country, which he wished to conquer, took care, as far as was possible, to be enlightened by his spies about political, military, and local conditions, and as a result entered into alliances with individual rulers by clever diplomacy, as before his Indian campaign, or sent out voyages of exploration, as before the Arabian expedition. On the other hand, he never advanced without having covered his rear. The Danube campaign and the punitive treatment of Thebes are to be regarded as precautions taken to cover his rear for the Asiatic campaign. When afterwards he made his first conquest in Asia, he began at once to secure the conquered territories from the military point of view, and to ensure peace and order by administrative arrangements. Later, when he penetrated into the heart of Asia, and went ever to more remote countries, he followed the same principle, and thus, in spite of the tremendous distances, which finally he put him between himself and home, he succeeded in never losing connection with it. Only once, at Issus, was he, by an unusual chain of events, cut off from his base of operations. Yet in a few hours he carved his way out of the dangerous situation. What proves his systematic method is that even in the Far East, the drafts for his army from Macedonia and Greece always reached him according to his directions. This was only possible because he deliberately and most carefully built up a system of rest stages. Without such measures, his success and his triumph over distances, which our military experts often admire more than his battles, would not be conceivable. Unfortunately, our information about his system of stages is extremely scanty, since the ancient authorities apparently knew nothing of the idea, so we must postulate rather than describe the army roads, but of many of the military and administrative measures which he took in the conquered territories. It may be assumed that they were meant in part or in the first instance to serve the temporary needs of the army, even if they were also to be permanent. From 330 onwards, Ecbatana may be regarded as the central point of this system. It was there that he left Parmenio with a strong force, and there that he concentrated the imperial treasure. Naturally, he also saw to food supply depots. Magazines on the military roads are sometimes mentioned. His numerous city foundations in eastern Iran, by which the land, conquered with so much difficulty, was secured from the military standpoint, served in the first place to maintain communications in the view of the Indian campaign, though the main object of these city foundations lay in the future. Among Alexander's great qualities as a general is the tenacity with which, when he once regarded anything as essential, he carried it out to the bitter end. He lay 7 months before Tyre, till he had got hold of it. On this account alone, one should not, as both ancients and moderns have done, compare Pyrrhus with him, that will of the wisp, who after 2 months abandoned the siege of Lilleberg, though it meant the collapse of his whole Sicilian expedition. He showed himself, too, a great leader of men, by participating in all the dangers and fatigues of his troops. In this way he carried them along with him. In battle he set them an example of supreme personal bravery. On the march there were no toils he did not share. If in sieges causeway or anything of the kind had to be constructed, he himself took a hand in the task, praised those who succeeded, and punished those who failed. When outstanding success had been gained, he liked to reward his troops by holding games and all sorts of festivities for them. His extensive money gifts to his army were a compensation for the prohibition of plundering the conquered districts, which for political reasons he thought necessary. This presupposes strict discipline, by the humanity with which after battles he cared for the wounded. He won the hearts of his soldiers. To his Macedonian officers he preserved to the end the attitude of a comrade, though not imposing in figure, for he scarcely reached middle height. He dominated everybody by his wonderfully bright eyes. The towering nature of his personality is most clearly exhibited in the fact that the men nearest to him, who after his death in many cases showed themselves to be strong rulers, blindly obeyed him during his lifetime. Nearchus says once, with reference to the beginnings of his ocean voyage, that the army believed in Alexander's wonderful luck, and was of opinion that there was nothing he could not dare and do, which Kaiser also and later Napoleon were able to evoke. It is more difficult to understand, or even to judge the statesman in Alexander, than the general, for his views as a statesman were in the state of flux when he was called away by an early death. None of his political creations had as yet taken definitive shape, and new plans were constantly emerging from his restless brain. It is impossible to conceive how different the world would have looked if he had lived only 10 or 20 years longer. How differently then should we be able to judge the youthful work which he did up to 323. We must never forget that we have only beginnings before us. In no single instance had the last word been spoken. Looked at externally, his evolution seems to show a continuous development from king of Macedonian and hegemon of the Corinthian League to great king of the Persian Empire, and finally to world ruler. And thus it has generally been represented in antiquity and today. But if from the standpoint of law one examines his relation to these different complexities of government, one finds instead of succession the continuance side by side of these different positions. Here, as generally, the historian cannot be content to work out the legal aspect. The true historical problem for him is to consider how the practice of political life stood to these forms. Let us first consider the legal forms. By acclamation of the army, Alexander became lawful king of Macedonia, and immediately afterwards by resolution the Sanhedrion, hegemon of the Corinthian League, which Philip had united as a free and sovereign league of states by union in his person with the kingdom of Macedonia. To this double position corresponded the duality of his war aims. On crossing the Hellespont, as hegemon, he wished to conduct the Panhellenic campaign of vengeance. As king of Macedonia, he wanted to conquer territory, but he did not incorporate in Macedonia what he conquered, as Philip had done as far as possible with his conquests, by immediately organizing as satrapies the earliest conquests on the soil of Asia Minor. He expressed the fact that these territories were to remain outside of Macedonia. Then, as hegemon, he incorporated in the Corinthian League the liberated Greek cities of Asia Minor, which were not included in the satrapies. As king, he continually conquered more territories, till after the final victory over Darius, he caused himself to be acclaimed by his Macedonians as king of Asia at Arbela. Yet in spite of this sanction from the assembly of the Macedonian army, the Asiatic Empire, as was said above, was not incorporated in the kingdom of Macedonia, but simply united with it by personal union. The acclamation of the army rather expressed the fact that it was the king of Macedonia to whom now belonged the rule over Asia. The foundation of Alexander's power was and remained his monarchy over Macedonia. 2. Whatever boundless size this Asiatic empire might grow, in political law it remained, just like the Corinthian League, an annex joined by personal union to Macedonia. The result of this was the quite different legal position which Alexander held in these 3 parts of his whole empire. In Macedonia he was and remained, like Philip and his predecessors, the king of the people and army, beside whom the nation in arms preserved its old rights in the assembly of the army. To the Greeks of the Corinthian League he was their hegemon, with the rights and duties laid down by the covenant of the League. As king of Asia, he was to the Asiatics an absolute ruler in the sense of the Achaemenids, as whose legal successor he regarded himself after the death of Darius. But this Asiatic absolutism was not uniform, since under the Achaemenids it had developed in various forms in different parts of the empire. And as far as possible, Alexander allowed these forms to continue unchanged. In Egypt, for instance, if we may count it as belonging to the monarchy of Asia on the ground, that it was an early part of the Achaemenid Empire, he was pharaoh and also divine. In Babylon, like Cyrus and Darius of old, king of the city but not a god. In the Phoenician and Cypriot cities, he kept their kings as his vassals, just as he retained Porus and Abbasaris in India. On the other hand, his absolutism did not hold good in Asia with regard to the Macedonians and Greeks of the army that attended him, or to the Greek cities which he founded. From the legal standpoint, this triple division of the whole empire remained unchanged till his death, for he created no new legal formula for the control of the whole area. He remained the king of Macedonia, to which the Corinthian League and the monarchy of Asia were bound by personal union. The unity of the whole world empire rested on his personality. We have now to ask whether in the actual practice of political life Alexander adhered to these legal forms as regards his different status in the 3 parts of his empire. In particular, the question arises whether the enormous authority which he acquired as king of Asia influenced his position with reference to Macedonia and the Corinthian League. The first point to be established is that Alexander was fully conscious of the legal distinction between his position in Asia and in Europe, that is, in Macedonia and the Corinthian League. This follows from the statement that from the death of Darius he sealed letters destined for Europe with his old Macedonian seal, and on the other hand those intended for Asia with the seal of Darius. An attempt has been made to interpret this as expressing the change from Macedonian sovereignty to the position of successor to the Achaemenids. The essence of the statement is rather that it testifies to the parallelism of the 2 legal positions. It is of the utmost moment that Alexander showed himself conscious, in principle, that his legal position in Asia did not also hold good for Europe. To Europe, he remained up to the end of his life king of Macedonia, and as such, also hegemon of the Corinthian League. Even when he was in Asia, he acted as king of Macedonia, when he had to send to Europe a communication affecting Macedonia or the League. The seal of Darius was used only for the kingdom of Asia. On the other hand, in the externals of Alexander's life, his Asiatic monarchy appears ever more obtrusively as time goes on. We must not, however, overlook the fact that in tradition, especially that hostile to him, this orientalization of the king is treated with special jealousy and great prejudice. Let us first examine his behavior as king of Asia. The use of Darius' seal confirms the view that after the death of Darius, Alexander felt himself to be his legitimate successor. Henceforth, on principle, he regarded the Asiatics no longer as his enemies, but as his subjects. Starting from this, he reached the thoroughly statesmanlike conviction that he must enlist the vigor contained in these nations for the great problems that Asia presented to him. This course commended itself the more as it was to be hoped that it would have a reconciling and a calming influence on the subjected peoples. In Caria and Egypt, he had already committed the civil administration to natives. And so, now that he had been proclaimed king of Asia at Arbela, he began to appoint Persian nobles as satraps. But they received only the civil power. Each had a Macedonian officer at his side as commander of the troops. The ultimate control was thus in Macedonian hands. A still more urgent necessity was the recruiting of his army with the elite troops of Asia. For his European troops were insufficient for the colossal plans he was revolving in his brain. The filling up of gaps with the Asiatic forces was absolutely imperative from the military point of view. Here, as in the administrative posts, he chose Iranians, especially Persians, and after the conquest of eastern Iran, its inhabitants too. Of the Semitic peoples, he utilized for the fleet the seafaring Phoenicians and Syrians, but did not put them into the land forces. We have seen how in the various reorganizations he connected these Iranians ever more closely with his army. Yet even in the last innovation at Babylon, in 323, when he actually drafted Persians into the Dakkats, the command remained in Macedonian hands. He did not, however, stop at the use of Iranians in the administration and the army, a use which will be recognized as politically right and required by circumstances, but went beyond it to the idea of a race fusion of his Macedonians with these Iranians. An idea which dominated him more and more, as we saw. In his last years, he himself set the example by his marriage with Roxanne, 327, and later by the mass marriage of Susa, 324. He expressed most plainly his political intentions. Obviously, he regarded this fusion as a means to an end. His aim was to build a bridge between the Macedonians, who were increasingly dissatisfied with the military employment of the Persians, and these same Persians, and to restore concord and agreement between the two peoples, so that hand in hand they might afford a sufficient guarantee against possible hostile reactions on the part of other nations of the empire. Thus conceived, the policy of fusion may be regarded as a statesman-like idea, however surprising the thought of race-breeding promoted by government may appear. And however doubtful it is whether such a fusion as Alexander desired was at all feasible, and finally, whether it would have had the effect for which he hoped. The notion of world sovereignty, which laid hold of him ever more strongly in his last years, must have contributed largely to the birth of such a thought in his mind. Only a world ruler, before whose eyes people lose their national significance, is capable of conceiving such a scheme. When in the memoranda about Alexander's latest plans, it is stated that he intended to transfer Asiatics to Europe and vice versa, in order that by mixed marriages, concord between the two continents might be brought about. This scanty extract leaves too many questions open for any certain inferences as to his last thoughts on the matter. In any case, the information neither compels nor justifies us in thinking that fusion was contemplated with any other race than the Iranian. In the Prayer at Opus, Alexander expressed very clearly the conception he held of his monarchy over Asia and his policy of reconciliation, when at the great feast of union he prayed to the gods that concord and partnership of rule might be granted to the Macedonians and Persians. As the Macedonians alone were insufficient for the ruling of Asia, the previously dominant Persians, who already under the Achaemenids had taken up a privileged position before the other nations of the world empire, were to be called to the leadership along with them. Alexander's Asiatic empire, for only to this can his words refer, was thus to become a Macedonian Persian empire, in this ideal only to be brought about by concord. He seems to have seen the best guarantee for the security and permanence of his Asiatic empire and his civilizing policy. His wish to be king of Asia in the form of ruler of a Macedonian Persian empire, Alexander also expressed in his attire. The statement concerning his royal dress, as it was after Darius' death, are very contradictory, since probably he only gradually adopted a definite use, and, especially at first, dressed differently, according as he had to appear before Macedonians and Greeks or before Persians. But one thing seems established, that he never adopted the entire costume of a Persian king. All are unanimous that he never wore the Persian trousers, which the Greeks regarded as especially barbaric and ridiculous. Nor does he ever seem to have worn the tiara, though this is disputed. The costume which is described to us, that which he wore every day, was a mixture of Macedonian and Persian garments. He wore the Macedonian chlamyas, a mantle and a purple one, like that worn by the Macedonian nobility, and the purple kosia, the specially Macedonian head covering, a round flat cap. From Persia he took the purple chiton, with the white stripe inserted in the middle, and the diadem, the ribbon, which the Persian king bound round his tiara, and Alexander round his kosia. It seems certain that his purpose was to wear this or similar attire only in Asia as king of Asia, and if he had returned to Macedonia or Hellas, he would assuredly have appeared in purely Macedonian garb, just as he sealed the documents he sent there with the royal seal of Macedonia. Though the idea of Macedonians and Persians sharing the rule of Asia was before his mind, he practiced Asiatic absolutism solely towards Asiatics, and not towards the Macedonians of the army who accompanied him in Asia. These he continued to regard as citizens of his kingdom of Macedonia. While Bessus was punished according to Persian laws, Philotas and other Macedonians suspected of high treason were brought before the assembly of the Macedonian army, and we never hear that this assembly lost its old rights in Asia. It is stated that when Alexander had to sit in judgment on Macedonians or Greeks, he did it so in simple form in a plain judgment hall. But on the other hand, when it was a question of Orientals, he delivered judgment in a magnificent tent of audience on a golden throne, like the great king, and with a great display of military pomp. We have already observed that even as king of Asia, he preserved an attitude of comradeship with the Macedonian officers, and to the Macedonian rank and file on the march, and in battle he was always the old army king. At the Feast of Reconciliation at Opis, though it was there that he proclaimed the common rule of Macedonians and Persians, nevertheless the Macedonians had the place of honor by Alexander above the Persians. In spite of the employment of Persians in administration and in the army, the command, as we saw, was reserved to the Macedonians. They were to take their place before the Persians in this joint rule. In spite of all this, the Macedonians were dissatisfied that Iranians were brigaded with them in the army, especially that their king partially adopted Persian dress, and also many details of the ceremonial of the Persian court. These are the things which are again and again adduced as stumbling blocks. When the Macedonians take up a hostile attitude, as in the catastrophe of Clearchus and at the mutiny of Opis, they felt that they were the victors, and they looked down with contempt on the vanquished Orientals. whose masters they intended to be. It is the profound tragedy of the life of Alexander that he could not convince the Macedonians of the necessity of his Iranian policy. Apart from the idea of the fusion of races, it must be regarded as necessary, and that thus a widening gulf opened to provide the king ever more and more from his people. To be sure, they had once to face the unpleasant fact that Alexander, in his endeavor to impose on them the obligation of the Persian prosokinesis, contemplated lowering them to the level of Persians. If, like the Persians, they were to throw themselves on the ground before him, this made him their absolute monarch. In this experiment, Alexander abandoned the different treatment of Macedonians and Asiatics, and sought to introduce in personal intercourse an equality between the two nations, in which the Persian, not the Macedonian, pattern would set the tone. We saw how, influenced by the passive resistance of his Macedonians, Alexander gave up the attempt and never returned to it. We here return to the question alluded to above, whether the immense preponderance of power which Alexander acquired in Asia affected his relation to the Macedonians and Greeks. In his attempts to introduce prosokinesis, we get our first example. The attempt concerned only those Macedonians and Greeks who were with him in Asia, for, as a matter of course, the innovation was only to hold good for his Asiatic court, and one will hardly find a similar example in his relation to his Macedonian kingdom. But in his dealings with the Corinthian League, there are contrary indications. Certain instances of neglect of the rights possessed by the League were to be observed in his earlier years, as in the condemnation of the Shiite traitors in Egypt. Still more damning is the condemnation and execution of Callisthenes, which was brought about by a private hearing before the king. Though Callisthenes, as a Greek, should have been brought before the Sanhedrion, which Alexander had at first thought of doing, there was a much more glaring case of interference in 324, when Alexander issued his decree about the exiles. Here he completely overrode the Sanhedrion, and by his own authority issued decrees to the states of the League, which most deeply concerned their interests. One must consequently admit that his position as hegemon was not uninfluenced by habituation to his Asiatic absolutism. If from the development of Alexander's own political attitude we turn to the organization of his Asiatic kingdom, we shall find it true that, as in generalship, so in administration, he was free from any uniformity of treatment. According to differing territorial circumstances, he chose very different forms of government, and in accordance with the change in his ideas, attempted new experiments. Yet he had no hesitation in cancelling what did not stand the test of practice. This especially applies to the administrative forms of the satrapy, which from the first, along with the name, he took over from the Achaemenids as the basis of his organization. In the early years, in the western part of his later empire, he gave the office as a rule to Macedonians. In the case of the first satrapy, that of Lesser Phrygia, he conferred on the satrap the full authority of the previous Persian satraps, but in the case of the second, that of Lydia, he introduced an important innovation, which he usually adopted later in this western area. While he entrusted this satrap with the military and civil power, he made a separate office for finance and taxation, which he bestowed on a special officer, not subordinate to the satrap. This means a very considerable limitation of the powers of the satraps. Besides, he placed a special commandment over the fortress of Sardis, just as he did later over the great fortresses of Pelusium, Memphis, Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis. The commandments of these imperial fortresses, it appears, were directly responsible to him. Even in the western area, he sometimes from policy gave the civil power to natives, as in Caria and Egypt, but in those cases he committed the military power to Macedonian officers. In the eastern area, first of all in Babylonia, he regularly adopted this arrangement for several years, placing beside the Persian satraps whom he appointed with civil powers only, Macedonian officers with the title of strategos, or overseer, episkopos. This measure corresponded, as we saw, to his idea of giving the Persians a share of authority, but of reserving the real power to the Macedonians. Of special finance officers, we hear nothing in the eastern satrapies, possibly because the economy of these regions was based not on currency, but on kind. But this arrangement, anyhow, never became a fixed scheme. In the difficult years of the war in eastern Iran, he sometimes had unfortunate experiences with his Persian satraps. So, from 328 onwards, with one exception, he made no more oriental satraps, and when after his return from India, he learned that in his absence, many of the oriental satraps had behaved badly, he punished and deposed them with iron severity. At the time of his death, only 3 satrapies were occupied by Iranians, and all the rest were in Macedonian hands. This disappointment did not shake him in his idea of the fusion of the nations, but as a practical statesman and in the interest of the security of his empire, he drew the necessary consequences and did not shrink from thus admitting that the experiment had been a failure. The political conditions of India suggested to him other combinations. There he generally left the small rajas in the principalities under his Macedonian satraps, but more powerful rulers like Porus and Abbasaris he placed outside the satrapies as independent vassal princes. The separate treatment of finance and taxation, an absolutely original idea of Alexander's, showed that he had a special interest in the financial arrangements of his new empire. In this department later on he introduced important innovations, which led gradually to a centralization. At first, in Egypt, he put the financial administration of the whole country and its dependencies in the hands of the Greek Cleomenes, and soon afterwards he combined several satrapies into large financial districts under the guidance of financial directors. Asia Minor west of the Taurus formed such a district under Philoxerxes, and Cilicia, Syria, and Phoenicia, and second under Coronanus. In 330, when he had become master of the huge Persian treasure houses, he resolved to separate the military chest and the imperial chest, which had hitherto followed the movements of the army, and to centralize the latter under his friend Harpalus as imperial treasurer by concentrating all the treasures at Ecbatana. Thus Harpalus, who soon removed to Babylon, was the sole head of the whole financial administration, of the taxes and treasures of the Asiatic Empire. Harpalus had not merely to guard the treasure, but to set to work to turn it into coined money. Alexander, as we saw, on principle abandoned the hoarding policy of the Persian kings, and by a currency began to put the idle bullion into circulation. Through the ever-increasing generosity with which he distributed the money in grants to officers, soldiers, and friends, and through the growing expenses of his court, the new treasures were soon passing from hand to hand. At his death, the state treasure is said to have been no more than 50,000 talents. Alexander's effort to unify the financial organization is very plainly seen in his measures for the coining of money. While in Persian days the great king had reserved to himself the coinage of gold, but had allowed the satraps to coin silver, which they did in every different types and values. Alexander reserved to himself the coinage of silver too, so that in the satrapies, with one passing exception in the case of Mezalus, there was only a royal currency, which was probably provided by the financial directors in the name of the king. Above all, he introduced a uniform standard, and probably for political reasons chose the Attic standard. In a short time, the new tetradrachm of Alexander was to have the highest value in the currency of the world. This creation of a uniform imperial currency is a remarkable instance of the insight of Alexander's economic policy. In the region of finance and currency, he carried out a centralization which raises his system above the confusion of the Achaemenid Empire. We see Alexander too as an economist who knew what he was aiming at when we recall what has been already related in detail about his development of trade and intercourse. He founded numerous cities, which were able and were intended to be the props of this distant traffic. His most magnificent foundation, Alexandria in Egypt, was from the first designed to be an emporium. Even among the new cities in the Far East were many, whose position on the old trade routes shows that they were designed to serve trading purposes, and so some of them are prosperous at the present day, like Herat, Kandahar, and Khojend. He opened new sea routes for trade. The voyage to Narkas connected his new colonial territory in India with Babylon. He himself intended shortly before his death to connect Babylon with Egypt by an expedition by sea round Arabia. He rendered the Tigris navigable, and a new Phoenicia was designed on the coast of the Persian Gulf. Great harbor works were begun at Patala and Babylon for the promotion of navigation and trade. All of these are achievable and designs of colossal dimensions, which display a genius at work, who intended to divert into the paths he regarded as right the world commerce of his world empire. It was indicated above of what extraordinary importance were Alexander's coining of the Persian hoarded treasures and his creation of an imperial currency for the economic life of these lands. It meant a quite new basis for the extension of money dealings. What efforts he made to raise the prosperity of the population and the fruitfulness of the countries has been shown us in his exertions to improve the network of Babylonian canals. He aimed at something of the sort in his design for the draining of Lake Copais in Boeotia, which was never carried out. From the activity of Gorgas in India, we may see that Alexander was eager to exploit the mineral wealth of the New World. Even when far away, he did not forget the economic interest of his home. After the conquest of the Aspasians north of Kabul, he picked out the finest and biggest of the great herds of cattle he had obtained in booty and sent them to Macedonia to improve the home breed. These are but scattered and accidentally preserved pieces of information, which give us, however, some idea how manifold were his economic interests. Finally, we come to his civilizing policy. Alexander marched out as the enthusiastic admirer of Greek culture, who was to open up the East to its influence. Did he remain faithful to this object after he had become acquainted with the old cultures of the East, which could not fail to impress his susceptible nature? Was he still faithful after the idea of a fusion of the nations had laid hold upon him in his last years with ever-increasing force? One thing is undeniable. In spite of all Iranian policy, he was personally, to the last, an enthusiastic admirer of Greek culture. The pupil of Aristotle never abandoned the idea of making his triumphal march also a journey of discovery, and of causing it to serve Greek science through the examination of lands hitherto unknown by the staff of experts who accompanied him. Out of the later years, we need only call to mind the zealous work of investigation in India, Nearchus' voyage of exploration, and finally the mission of Heraclides to the Caspian Sea. Moreover, the attempt by Harpalus, made to acclimatize European plants in the gardens of Babylon, may unquestionably be set down to Alexander's initiative. His love of Greek literature remained unchanged to the end. He started out with Homer, and later be sent from the Far East for other works of literature, classical and modern. He had special venerations for the three great tragedians, above all for Euripides, whom he knew so well that at times he could recite scenes out of him from memory. If the poets who accompanied his traveling court were not of the first rank, that was not the fault of his taste, but of the low level of Greek poetry at the time. Besides the poets, there were also in his camp philosophers and philosophically educated men of the most different schools, cynics like Onesicritus and Anaximenes, a Democritian like Anaxarchus, and his pupil Philo the skeptic. The intellectual life at the court of Alexander, which we picture as very animated, was thoroughly Greek. So far as we know, he had no acquaintance with the literatures of the Oriental peoples. This is probably not to be explained simply by the lack of knowledge of the languages, as the deficiency might have been removed by the use of interpreters. The literatures of Egypt, Babylon, Persia, and India apparently remained unknown to him. He seems to have had a certain interest in the Indian gymnosophists, and at his invitation, the Indian Kalanas was a guest at his court for several years, up to the time of his self-immolation. But we hear nothing of any deep intellectual intercourse. If Alexander, as we saw, sacrificed to the Oriental gods, he was behaving thereby as a true Greek. But it is noteworthy that, for political reasons, he caused the Persian Magians to officiate along with the Greek soothsayers at the Feast of Reconciliation and Opus. He never sought any acquaintance with the sacred books of the Persian religion. From the literary point of view, he remained exclusively Greek. Greek art, too, remained for him the art. In Egypt, he ordered the execution of extensions to the temples of Ammon at Karnak and Luxor, and in Babylon he arranged the rebuilding of the temple of Marduk, but these acts were dictated by political reasons. In both cases, the buildings were of course executed in the native style, yet it has recently been observed that the reliefs in those sanctuaries at Karnak and Luxor exhibit the influence of Greek art. We never hear that he caused Oriental artists to work for him. On the contrary, he exclusively employed Greeks. He preferred to have his portraits made by Apelles and Lysippus, which witness to his understanding of the art of the time. His architects also were Greek, but in the buildings which he commissioned them to erect, a certain approximation to Oriental art is observable in the gradually growing tendency towards colossal dimensions. We recognize the direct influence of the gigantic Babylonian ziggurats in the design for the mausoleum of Hephaestion at Babylon, and even in its forms as well. The tent of audience at Susa also was modeled on the Persian Ampadana. The 6 temples, which according to his latest memoranda, he planned for Greece and Macedonia, at Delos, Delphi, and Dodona, and at Dion, Amphipolis, and Cyrus. They were never executed, were to be colossal buildings, though in pure Greek forms. The gigantic sum of 1,500 talents was to be spent on each of them. At the same cost, a huge temple to Athena was to be erected at Ilium. It is also stated that he intended to build a monument to his father Philip of the size of the pyramid of Cheops, a plain proof with what reverence he clung to his earthly father to the end. In this, too, there is clear evidence of rivalry with the East. If thus, at least in architecture, an Eastern influence is unmistakable. On the other hand, Alexander appears as the representative of pure Hellenism in his cult of competitive games. And in their introduction into the Orient, he liked to arrange gymnastic and musical competitions, when after a victorious issue, he wished to give his troops refreshment and distraction, and to render his gratitude to the gods. Competition for a prize of victory was a specific element of Greek culture, and it was quite unknown to the East. So when Alexander exhibited such games after sacrificing to Apis at Memphis, he meant in this way to proclaim that henceforth Greek culture should have a footing in Egypt alongside of Egyptian. In the East, especially in Hither Asia, where the requisite Greek performers were more easily procured, he instituted such games with special magnificence after his return from India, and gave proof thereby of his wish to extend Greek art in the Oriental world. But nothing actually had so strong an effect on the Hellenization of the East, so far as one can speak of anything of the kind, as Alexander's foundation of cities, particularly those new foundations, which are expressly designated as poleis, that is, as Greek cities, such as were founded in Egypt, preeminently in eastern Iran and India. The colonists settled in these cities were chiefly Greek mercenaries, many thousands of whom were left behind in these spots, along with a lesser number of Macedonians, probably veterans for the most part, as these mercenaries to a great extent came from that uprooted proletariat, whose settlement in Asia Minor Isocrates had recommended to Philip. One may, from this point of view, regard Alexander's city foundations as a solution, on a grand scale, of a social and economic problem. Often in practice, if there was not much time available, only the city walls were built by the army under Alexander's orders, and the rest of the building left to the colonists. These cities received from him a Greek constitution, a council, popular assembly, and city magistrates. In spite of this, they seem not to have possessed complete autonomy, and in all likelihood were directly under the king. For obvious practical reasons, Alexander always founded his cities in connection with already existing townships. Alexandria in Egypt, for instance, was close to Rakotos, and the old inhabitants continued to live in these townships. The natives, however, did not belong to the citizen body of the new polis. Only Greeks and Macedonians received citizenship. In this way, there came into existence Greek communities, where Greek law, Greek worship, and Greek habits of life prevailed, in immediate connection with older native settlements. Even at first, the colonists held aloof from the natives. In the course of time, approximation was bound to take place, and ultimately, a mixture ensued. For want of Greek women, Greeks and Macedonians were compelled to take Oriental wives, and it was inevitable that through them, Oriental customs and views of life entered Greek families. On the other hand, the juxtaposition created the possibility of elements of Greek culture being appropriated by the natives. At the time of the foundation of the cities in eastern Iran, Alexander had already conceived the idea of bringing the Iranians into closer relation with the Macedonians and Greeks, and soon afterwards he was busy with the fusion of these peoples. The prospect, therefore, of a gradual mixture of cultures in the settlements cannot have run counter to the views which he then held. Was he thus unfaithful to his original object of spreading Greek culture in the East? Personally, in spite of all the political concessions which he made to the Iranians, he remained the last, as we saw, a thorough admirer of Greek culture, and it must accordingly still have been his ambition to make Greek culture prevail as far as possible. But just as he had learned as a politician that he could not rule his Asiatic empire with Macedonians alone, so in active contact with Oriental cultures, it must have been clear to him that neither could he make Greek culture exclusively dominant. The chief requisite was that centers should at first be created from which the spread of Greek culture should take its start. And that is what he accomplished by the cities which he founded. Though mixtures of culture might be expected later, yet in his attitude to Greek culture, he must have had the desire and confident expectation that it would be the leading factor. The great question of the future, in fact, was, which of the two cultures would prove itself the stronger? For many centuries, this was the chief problem of the history of civilization. The first condition was created by the city foundations of Alexander.